Now, the next thing that I'm going to do now as I'm considering this report is I'm really going to be walking through this report and trying to notate, oh, look, that is similar to what the school team found. All right, so we have some alignment here. And then I'm looking at, oh, look, they found something different than either we found. Maybe it's completely different performance by the student, or maybe the outside person looked at an area that the school-based team did not look at for whatever reason. Hi, everyone. Jenny Ponzuric here with another Prepared School Psych podcast episode. Today, I want to talk about independent educational evaluations, or IEEs. As we know, parents can obtain an IEE at public expense. School districts must consider IEE information, but as with any outside information, teams are not bound by, nor must they automatically accept the information within the IEE report. So, what does it mean to consider this information? First, I do believe it's helpful for school assessment team members to review the report carefully and document any questions that are arising as you are reading so that the team is ready for this meeting. Follow-up questions may need to be asked of our general education teachers. Data may need to be collected before the IEP meeting where we are considering and discussing the IEE report. Now, when your team is considering this information, I wanted to share with you a couple of questions that might guide your team when reviewing this outside report. The first question I always look for is, how was the information obtained? We know in the school system, we always strive to make sure that we are collecting multiple sources of data. We are reviewing records. We are interviewing anyone who will talk to us. We are observing students typically in multiple settings. Sometimes we are giving standardized or criterion reference tests. We're looking at work samples. There's so many pieces of data that we are taking a look at. When you are reviewing the report, the IEE report, I look for the same type of thing. What are all the sources of data that are documented in this report? Was this person able to come to the school and observe the student in the educational setting? Did this IEE provider, were they able to reach out and connect with our staff to make sure that they were gathering information about how the student performs in the educational setting? If there are parent rating scales that are completed, were there also teacher rating scales that were completed as well? The second thing I want to take a look at is, what period of time was the testing or the assessment completed? For example, I have reviewed IEE reports and noticed that maybe hours and hours and hours of testing was completed all in one day. For some of the students that I work with, given multiple breaks, some of my students are able to do that. Some of our students are not able to do that. So in those kind of situations, I might be ready with some follow-up questions about, what was the student's demeanor near the end? In what order were these tests administered? So that if we're seeing major differences between the IEE report and the school's last report, I want to make sure all of that is taken into consideration, especially if we see differences in performance. The third thing that I want to take a look at is, I want to make sure for myself, as well as any of my team members, are there any tests or tools that were used by the IEE provider that we are unfamiliar with? And in those cases, I just want to ask, where can we find that information? So for example, I was recently reading a report that was provided to the school by the parent from an outside provider, and there was a test that was administered that personally I've never heard of before. So of course, the first thing I do is go to the Google, right? And try and figure out, what kind of information can I glean from there? Now, a lot of tests, of course, on their websites, I'm not going to be able to gather information about norming samples and validity and reliability and information like that. The second thing I went to were our wonderful school psych Facebook groups. And I immediately posted a question: does anyone have familiarity with this test? Because if so, I wanted to see, could I ask some follow-up questions and different things like that. I wanted to make sure that if we were going to go into a meeting and discuss these results, that I'm familiar with these results. Now, I am, of course, in my role as a school psychologist. So I'm looking at a lot of the results that a school psychologist would administer. So cognitive, processing, social, emotional, and so forth. However, I have to admit that if I see a speech and language test that I'm unfamiliar with, I might go and talk with my SLP on my campus. Hopefully, they've read the report as well, and we can discuss that other test that I am unfamiliar with. I just want to make sure I understand all of the tools that were being used. The next thing I want to look at is whether or not all of the tests that were administered, do I think they were valid for this student? We have so many different assessment tools that are available to all of us who are assessing students. And so, taking into consideration the student's age, taking into consideration things like English learner status and different things like that, are there any questions about the validity of any of the assessment tools that were administered? Now, the next thing that I'm going to do now as I'm considering this report is I'm really going to be walking through this report and trying to notate, oh, look, that is similar to what the school team found. All right, so we have some alignment here. And then I'm looking at, oh, look, they found something different than either we found. Maybe it's completely different performance by the student, or maybe the outside person looked at an area that the school-based team did not look at for whatever reason. Now, for myself, just from a logistics standpoint, I just want to share, I usually create a table. I open up Microsoft Word or Google Doc and I immediately create a table. I start notating for myself what page number that I am looking at so that when we go back to the meeting, I can easily say, well, on page 16, you stated this. So I'm going to put the page number, summarize really briefly what I noticed in this outside report. And then in the right-hand column, I'm usually making notes to myself. So I might say, oh, look, we found similar results. Or, oh, look, these are different. I wonder why they're different, right? Then I am noting whether or not do I need to go ahead and follow up and collect any additional data. If they looked at something that we did not look at, perhaps I need to follow up with our teacher to see whether or not the teacher has noticed this as well. So I might be looking and making notes about, okay, we might want to look at some work samples. We might want to take a look at some behavior data. Whatever that difference is, I want to make sure that I understand that information. And again, give our team time to collect any information, examine any information that we have to feel good about going into a conversation about this. One of the other things that I will do in that table is I will notate any questions that are coming up for me that might help explain why we were seeing different results. So, as I'm doing a first glance through this IE report, these are all the things that I start doing for myself just to kind of keep track of my thought process. I know many people, of course, are printing out that report, they're highlighting different things, they're writing in the margins, whatever works for you. But that for me is a way to kind of organize my thinking. Now, also in the table, I am going to be looking at what conclusions were drawn in regards to diagnoses, eligibility for special education in this IEE report. As we know, some of our IEE providers are very knowledgeable about educational eligibility, but not everyone has the same background that we have working in the school system. So again, looking at any sort of conclusions that were made, do we agree or disagree? Perhaps this other person who did this outside report gave information or gave test or gathered information that the school-based team members did not. And maybe there's new information that we really need to take into consideration. Perhaps there's a question that we're just kind of wondering, how did they get to that conclusion? I want to start jotting all of that information down. And again, writing down any follow-up questions that I have in regards to the conclusion. Now, typically after the conclusion, what I have found in many school-based reports as well as many IEE reports is there's typically a list of recommendations or suggestions. So again, I tend to go through those line by line, and I will look at the recommendations and I will just make notes for myself. They suggested this accommodation. Oh, look, that accommodation's in the IEP. Check. We are in agreement. Oh, look, they suggested this accommodation. Oh, that actually seems like a good idea now. We didn't think about that. We'll want to add that. Or they suggested this accommodation or this service. These are the reasons why our team did not think that that was needed at the time of our meeting. Let's reconsider this. Is this something that we want to consider at this meeting? Or if there's disagreement, we want to again make sure that we're ready to explain our reasoning for that. We have now gone through and reviewed the report, documented our questions, and now hopefully our team is ready for this meeting. Sometimes the outside provider is there at the meeting to explain their results. Sometimes they're not, but we want to make sure that we are discussing this report. And in these cases, I definitely want to make sure that whoever is taking notes during this meeting is really good at taking notes. So I sometimes will suggest that we have two people taking notes. So a lot of times we do some notes on a shared Google Doc so that more than one person can be really documenting that discussion. These are the questions that were posed. These were the pieces that everyone was in agreement about. We want to document any disagreements. This is what this person said. This is what this person said, right? So we want to make sure the note taking which is going to be an important piece to document how the school-based team members documented the considering of the IEE report. Okay, I hope this information and these tips were helpful. If you didn't get a chance to write everything down, no worries. Check the show notes and get access to the handout that summarizes this episode. If you are already part of the Prepared School Psych community, check out our IEP report card page because the handout is already there. Until next time, everyone. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. And I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.